When I was 10 years old, I came to the realization that I may not be white, as I do have 0 drops of European or white blood in me. But as long as I look like they do, as long as I look white and I maintain that look, then I'd be okay. It's a weird feeling, that feeling of limbo, the feeling that I'm either too white for any foreigners or I'm too foreign for any white people. It's weird that I decide to prioritize being white as part of myself in the first place, almost like a sort of safety mechanism. You know what else is weird? The fact that I was that young and placing such heavy emphasis on my skin color out of paranoia is weird. And that weird thing casts such an insane reflection on our society. A society that likes to place one color of skin over another in the form of cruel hierarchy. Even at that young age, I thought that as long as I maintained and I looked white or acted white, then I would have it easy. Having it easy by not having to worry about getting cut, killed, or harmed based on who I am or the way I look. So, if I were to rule the world, I wouldn't rule it at all. Because the world is a diverse canvas of different colors, and placing one color with one brush over it all would ruin it. When the first thought and idea of what racism was, or prejudice was, came into my head, I was 7 years old, and I was in the 1st grade. It was a bit of a weird introduction. It was from a picture book about Martin Luther King Jr., which doesn't sound so weird until you get to the end. The end where MLK makes his speech, segregation is ended, MLK is shot, and then racism is solved and we lived happily ever after. It didn't quite literally say that, but it definitely inferred it heavily. There are quite a lot of other books with that same dismissive tone. If you don't think telling a group of impressionable young children that racism or something like racism is a thing that doesn't matter and it's a thing of the past, then isn't weird, then I don't know what is. From what I can remember from that time, there were not really any recent conversations on any recent race issues. What do I mean by that? I mean, whenever racism or prejudice was brought up, it was brought up only in a historical sense, something that happened way further in the past, and not as something that currently affects us, but also many different people around the world today. You can call it a form of gaslighting because, well, it kind of is. Let's say you have someone that's an actual victim of racial prejudice, whether mentally or physically. And you're basically telling them that your trauma, your experiences, what you went through either didn't happen, it's either in your head, or, it's not bad. Because simply his racism is just a thing in the past, and racism doesn't supposedly exist. Because we as a society like to do this thing where we like to shove our issues under the rug and forget about them completely and not confront them. Therefore, we get people that are detached from their sense of self, people that really don't know who they are and that hate the very look of themselves, that will turn to abusing themselves because they think something is wrong with them. And they'll continue abusing themselves as long as they think it's normal. And what has become normal is pretending that we don't abuse or harm other people based on who they are and what they look like. And when we pretend that we don't, we cease to see the effect that it has. And when we don't see the effect that it has, we don't see it at all. And therefore, we repeat it again and again and again. Some of you may be telling to yourselves that actually you're outliers. You're not racist. You don't see race. You don't see color whatsoever. You actually treat everybody that you know equally. And I'm not saying that, you're racist secretly, but what I am saying is that, to break it to you, that sort of thinking, or if that sort of thinking is a rarity to come by. It's a rarity, and it's nearly impossible to truly think like that, because we as people have embedded this hierarchy of colorism and prejudice into our society so deeply, to the point where you don't even realize when you're being racist yourself, let alone even realizing that you're a victim of it. And then we wonder why children, or young people in general, are openly talking about wanting to harm themselves or burn their skin in order to look a little bit prettier, or to look beautiful a few shades lighter. You're going to be surprised by how normal that kind of talk is, especially by the amount of times that I've heard it. It's normal because we made it normal, even though, strangely enough, we as human beings are basically the only animals on this planet that actively target and hate each other of the same species. So you may be asking yourselves, how do we exactly, confront this? More importantly, where does prejudice come from? How do we confront it? Those are the questions that I'm here to discuss. But before I go on, I want to admit, in a pretty depressing way, that if it weren't for the color of my skin, I would have a much noticeably harder life. Years of comfort and ease would have otherwise been non-existent for me. Constant harassment and stigma were practically non-existent in my daily life. Let alone even employment. I can actually build a life for myself, and I can find a job, because employers are less likely to squint their eyes at you if you are a few shades lighter, just like they already do. Let me use my home country, Canada, as an example. The employment rate for Black Canadians is much noticeably lower, as you can see. Even though they do have the same qualifications, the employment rate is still at, for Black Canadians, 77.2%. compared to the rest of the overall population being at 82.8%. You can kind of say that I had this, protective shield over me, this illusion of whiteness that kept me safe. I say it's an illusion because I was considered white until I wasn't. Whenever I would tell people where I was really from, or what my true ethnicity was, whether I'd say I'm from the Middle East, I'm West Asian, or Asian for that matter of fact, I would get these strange looks. These looks weren't particularly negative to say. They weren't like out of malice. They weren't angered because of me, but it was looks that made me feel as though I was more so an exotic piece, someone from a faraway, strange land, rather than someone that's either from the same city as you or from the next neighborhood over. Don't you find it crazy that something so embedded and something so widespread like whiteness, the concept of whiteness and its privileges, can be applied to so many people, but can be taken away from you within seconds, almost like a ticket? When I put it that way, it sounds like a game, something so like outlandish that you can't believe it exists, let alone we creating that. Which is why I ask myself the question, why do we as people continue to, consciously or subconsciously, preserve and invest in this hierarchy that we've built, even if it is at the detriment of each generation moving forward? Speaking of future generations, like I said before, earlier on, racism and prejudice is something that is taught to you. You can't inherit it naturally. It's something that you get and absorb from your surroundings, aka society. And so, what comes to mind when you think of who are the most impressionable and susceptible people to outside influences? It's usually, you think about little kids, and you wouldn't be wrong. Little kids from ages 4 to 9 or even 10 years old. So let me set the scene. It's the 1940s, and two psychologists Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark are experimenting based on the effects of how does racial segregation affect children, specifically black children in that age range. And so I'm sure most of you know what segregation is and the effect that it had on black people. So the experiment went as followed. There were 2 dolls, and there's the group of children that the dolls would be shown to one by one. The 2 dolls were either black or white. The white doll had light skin and light hair. The black doll had dark skin and dark hair. And so when the children were shown the doll, they were asked to describe it. More importantly, that's what they were looking for. It was the description. And so when the children would receive the white doll, their descriptions were along the lines of, something admirable. The doll was pretty, the doll was beautiful. Its hair, its skin, and whatnot. But when it came down to showing off the black doll to the kids, it was quite the opposite. To put it shortly, a lot of the descriptions were often filled with, melancholy. It was dread. They didn't like the doll. They thought it looked ugly. It was something that was not admirable. And to put it simply, the black doll was inferior to the white doll that they considered much prettier. I hope you kept in mind that those children were black themselves. And it would be a little bit strange to say that these children are actually born with that idea in their head, even though they look like the very thing that they're criticizing. Which is why I asked, where else could they have gotten those ideas from? They were taught that. It's nurture over nature. And so that's how that comes to show how barbaric we have become as human beings, pinning one group of people against the other, or pinning people amongst themselves in a form of cannibalism, almost like a social cannibalism if you put it even deeper. So now, obviously, that was in the 1940s, and we've moved on quite a lot from then. You wouldn't be wrong to say that we've improved, because we have improved since then. That was 80 or so years ago. But, and I can't speak for everyone, because again, my experiences with prejudice or racism is largely different from other people, either different or is minimal compared to the other experiences we hear about or we don't hear about. What I can say is that we have a problem, and we still have a problem. Think of it almost like a piece of lead stuck in the palm of your hand. It's there, but you don't like looking at it. And no matter how far you move in life, whether 30, 40 years on, it's still going to be there no matter how many times you try to ignore it. And up until you actually acknowledge it and get it taken out, it's going to follow you to the grave. It's never going to leave, and it's still going to be in the exact same spot that it was. Now back to the hypothetical. If I were to rule the world, would it make sense for me, light-skinned, light-colored English speaker from North America, to rule over someone from, let's say, across the Atlantic, from Ghana or Mali, someone that's of a darker skin shade, and someone that has completely different cultural traditions to what I have. And I don't know what those traditions are, and I'm not familiar with them at all, even the language that they speak. Would it make sense for me to rule over, let's say, a farmer from Indonesia, someone who eats a completely different food from me, a food that I don't understand, cultural traits and mannerisms that I also can't understand and probably won't for most of my life? Would it make sense? What gives me to put myself on such a high pedestal above 8 billion people on this planet? If you don't see the strangeness in that, then we are doomed to repeat this cycle of prejudicial torture on and on and on. Thank you.